So right now we're going to have our second session for the afternoon. This is Canadian Immigration, Temporary Foreign Worker Program Compliance, and our key speaker will be Rami Fakhoury. He's a managing attorney and key partner at Fakhoury Law Group, or Fakhoury Global Immigration, as we're transitioning that way. He's enjoying his 20th year as head of that firm. This year is an anniversary, and they're very excited with all of the growth and development that the firm is enjoying. His firm will also support immigration to over 100 countries around the world, and he's been named U.S. Corporate Immigration of the Year by Lawyers Weekly magazine, and his firm is based in Detroit, Michigan, or Troy, which is close by Detroit. So Rami, come on up and be here on the panel. I'll introduce the others. Yay. All right, thanks, Rami. Also on the panel, I think, well, that's fine. We'll be here with Rami here at this point. And here's the clicker. And Kiran SN, if you would come up. He's Deputy General Manager at HCL Technologies with specialization in global delivery and risk management. And he's been a previous participant in our conferences, and we really enjoy Kiran being here with us. So panel, welcome, and we're looking forward to hearing from you. Rami.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you for being here and your interest in this panel. I have a slight and sort of short presentation regarding Canadian work visas. Can everyone hear me clearly? Is it ricocheting? And then I just really wanted to just turn it over to the panel. In fact, Karen and I had a discussion earlier, and he actually had the opportunity of meeting some very high officials from the Canadian government and had some very interesting insight that actually I learned some things. And I'd love for the rest of the crowd here to learn as well. And of course, the news is always a wealth of knowledge as well. But very proud to serve with these two gentlemen. So, okay, sorry. Okay, so now I just have to figure this out, right? Jake, I'm sorry, I'm not. Sorry, excuse me. Is this?
It will be turned on.
How many of you are familiar with the overall Canadian process and the Canadian work visa scheme? Can I see a show of hands? How many of you use Canadian work visas on a regular basis? If I can see hands. So quite a few. Okay. How many of you like Canada more than America? Just kidding. Especially after yesterday. No, just no comments. In any event, so I think we're just waiting for the slide. Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, here we go. Okay, so just a very quick high-level overview here is basically the Canadian process. They overhauled it, but historically, the temporary foreign worker program's objective was basically to allow foreign workers to come in as a last resort if there are no available Canadian workers, similar to the U.S. and other countries. But basically, the overall themes were no reciprocity, and then basically unilateral and discretionary. Majority of the immigration has been lower skilled and based on employer demand to fill specific jobs. Many of the main source countries have been developing countries for Canada versus developed countries. And of course, they added a much more vibrant labor market impact assessment, which we'll discuss in a little bit more detail. And again, you have to be very sure that there are no Canadians that are going to lose their jobs because of the situation. So, and similar to the United States, it has to be an employer-specific work reason for the immigration. So, okay, oh boy, wrong way. Okay, so let's just move on to the overhaul of the temporary foreign worker program, which is improving the clarity, transparency, and the accountability for the Canadian immigration system. So on a very, again, high level, basically Citizenship and Immigration Canada overlooks the whole scheme. It's based largely on reciprocity, not based on employer demand. Majority of high-skilled, high-wage. Main source countries are highly developed, and there's no labor market impact assessment required. Generally open work permits, and then it's based also too, there's some leadway for NAFTA and some other things that we'll see what will happen with the elections, what occurred in the United States. This, again, is the labor market impact assessment. The employer basically has to post the job advertisement in at least 3 forums. It has to evaluate any candidates for the job, and then from there you prepare the application, and then of course you apply for work permit. The process is right here. I don't want to go over that because I really want to get into the discussions, but basically approximately a month's time in terms of recruiting, 1 to 2 weeks normally for interviews, and then 3 months approximately for adjudications. Has been taken longer, goes back and forth, and then it can take 6 to 8 weeks for the work permit. The intercompany work transfer permit. Basically, they've really cracked down on this compared to the past. Now they're really scrutinize the relationship between the Canadian entity and the foreign entity. The individual that's going to come to the United States has to have at least 1-year tenure with the employer, and the wages have to meet prevailing wage under the Canadian system. And of course, there has to be a high level of proprietary knowledge and advanced knowledge, experience with the company, using the company's information and skills. Intercompany work permit is good for 3 years, can be renewed for an additional 2 years. And again, it's the argument to overcome the requirement of, for specialized knowledge has really gone up quite dramatically compared to a few years ago. Then the reason for that is compliance. Amesh keeps mentioning compliance and why technology is important. Most governments are really concerned with their middle class. There is this notion that foreign workers are taking away jobs from locals, whether it's in the United States, France, Canada, et cetera. So governments have repositioned their policies to protect the middle class and to actually grow the middle class. And these policies are forcing governments to do greater compliance and audits, and it's really impacted Canada. I think about 4 or 5 years ago, it was a much more liberal situation. We may see that again, which we'll discuss in a few minutes. Canadian visas are taking much longer to attain. They're talking about, a 2-week process. They're also even talking about an exemption for IT and tech workers from the LMAIA, sorry. And if that occurs, I think that would be very good for business. But in the meantime, it is much more of a rigorous process. And I just also want to mention the potential of if you do breach the compliance and penalties that you have to go through. Basically, you're initially given a warning, then it moves on to bars from 2 to 10 years, and then penalties as severe as $100,000 per violation. So it's a very severe thing. They will also look at the size of the company and the history of compliance, et cetera, in terms of assessment of penalties. So with that said, though, I'd like to move into the panel discussion with my colleagues here because I don't want to take up all the time here. And I want Karen to, first and foremost, probably just give me an update on your most recent interaction with the Canadian authorities, if you don't mind, please.
Thanks, Rami.
Sure.
So I think for the last few months or so, all of the people here in the room been experiencing unpredictability in the Canadian ICT program, and I think because of the hard attestations that are coming in the LMIA, I would be surprised to see a lot of them would be doing that. So ICT was the only route for Indian IT companies to send people to Canada. But post, I think when Rami mentioned about the changes to the temporary foreign worker program from 2014, and then more definition of specialized knowledge was put up by the CIC in 2015. We have seen a lot of unpredictability in the whole ICT adjudications. So we had taken it up with NASSCOM, and NASSCOM was also worried about the trade issues. So we had met Mr. Bob Orr, who was the Deputy Immigration Minister at the Canadian government in August. It was a very positive conversation we had. We put up our views of how the relationship can be improved, what are the changes to be done. Some of them was to make the bar more visible of how they want the companies to send people. It was very not clear at that point of time. And subsequent to that, the previous Monday, that's on November 7th, we were again invited to meet the Immigration Minister, Mr. John McCallum, and Anuj was also here, and my another colleague from IBM, Aman, was also there. I think they would also agree that the conversations were very positive with him. Just a few days before, there was a report which was put up by the House of Commons in Canada, which interestingly had a lot of suggestions that we have given during that meeting with them. So they've been quite acknowledging the fact that yes, there needs to be improved, but they also have conveyed very clearly that they would probably not go back to the good old days of having unlimited access to people's movement. So I think that's the new norm that's going to come up. You would be given access to the labor market, but with restrictions. I think that's everybody in the room would agree that is something that's a new norm, and we should have our processes around it. Also, they had in the report also mentioned, I think you would be aware that that came out on November 3rd or 4th, which said that they're going to have a short-term 30-day work permit without too many restrictions, but that 30 days is for 1 year. So I mean, as always we do, right? They tell us 30 days, we want 90 days. If they tell us 90 days, we want 180 days. So we try to convey that 30 days is something very difficult in the whole software development life cycle. So that's something that we have conveyed to them. They also are going to come up with a highly skilled program where companies who invest a lot in Canada, who are able to bring who need to bring highly skilled migrants, they're going to have a separate initiative or program for those. By and large, I think it's been a very positive conversation, and I think all of us acknowledge the positive environment that the Canadian High Commission always prepares. I don't think we've been able to do anything of such large change, at least in the mindset of the people, that what we've been able to achieve at the Canadian High Commission. So this, and finally, the point that the minister made was that this is something that should be seen to be coming up in the next few months. Because we met him on November 7th, he didn't commit on the year end with the Christmas and the Thanksgiving happening. So I think it's on the radar, it's on the horizon. We definitely would want to see that as quickly as possible. And also they've acknowledged the fact that they need to bring more predictability into the specialized knowledge definition. Frankly, I don't think that would be very much clearer, but I'm definitely sure that we would have more definition of what they're looking into, so that we could probably use those parameters to ensure that we meet them and then get those approved. So there's a few updates that I wanted to share, Rami, with you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Anuj, I believe you attended the same meeting?
That's right.
Is there anything else that you can espouse on?
The only thing which I think Kiran missed out, or maybe I missed out, was the expedited LMIA, labor market assessment, is one thing which they are looking at coming up with, and they're saying that within 15 days we would let you know on that. So that was a point, I believe, which
so basically a 2-week process.
A two-week process,
which is going to be very challenging for them, but they say that they're going to implement this.
Absolutely. And, coming from a point where a couple of years back they probably were doing it in a little more, and sudden misuse which probably happened on that resulted in this far more stringent process being put in place. Now, if you're trying to go back and beat a record or create a record and saying that, within 2 weeks, I'm going to give you a decision on a labor market impact assessment, not really sure how long it's going to last or what are the kind of controls they're going to put in place for that to ensure that the misuse doesn't happen, and then, 2 years or 3 years down the road, we are back to square one all over again.
Well, and I didn't have the good fortune of attending that meeting, but basically just reading based on what the Canadian government is looking at doing under the Administrative Monetary Penalties Act, basically they're going to really assess what companies are doing, and it's going to be administered through CIC and the Employment, Social and Development Canada department. But basically, if a company violates provisions, and you have to follow exactly what you represent. So if you represent certain criteria, whether it's pay, duties, etc., in an LMIA, you must follow that very, very thoroughly, because they're going to be reviewing this. And if there is a penalty, or if there's a violation, then there will be a penalty. They're going to look at the nature of the violation, they're going to look at the severity of the violation, and then they're going to look at the compliance history of the company. And they're also going to look and see whether the company has willfully stepped forward and disclosed this within reasonable time, or is this something they kind of did and dragged out. So these are very, very critical. They're also going to break it up between small companies, large companies, depending on revenues and number of employees. So I think if a company is not in compliance, or if you have any issues, or even if you're in full compliance, I think having internal audits is very critical to make sure that you flush this out internally before it comes up. And if there's a major issue, I think disclosure is the right thing to do. And furthermore, I think just make sure that whatever you present in any petition is really followed to the T, and you have a compliance and a review process afterwards, because anything that changes has to be the government has to be notified. You cannot execute a change without notification, and they're going to take that very severely. So hopefully prevent what occurred a few years ago. They say all politics are local, and I think Canada, like many other countries, is experiencing an aging population. And a lot of companies and a lot of investors are saying, we cannot bring in the required talent that we need, especially in IT and tech. And so the Canadian government is trying to balance protection of the middle class, or the workers, if you will, and make sure that foreign workers are not abused. At the same time, they don't want to hamper investment in growth and innovation, which they really need, in addition to the fact that Canada is really looking to now aggressively grow its population. So I also tell the business community and the corporate community, it's very critical to make sure that you self-police. I think all companies have to set a standard by industry, and we need to make sure that we continue to comply and use best practices to comply. Sometimes it may get hard or difficult to compete in a market where a company may take a much more liberal approach to certain things. But I have to say, that one company is no longer impacting just its performance, and it'll probably be severely penalized. They're going to impact the entire industry. And I think that it's much more visible now, because it hits social media, it hits the news, it hits your employees. And so I think there's a great return in terms of really looking at your internal controls and making sure that you're compliant. And I think even just having conferences like this, where there's dialogue and information, where companies can simply discuss situations, discuss scenarios. And I like the fact that both of you are in your companies, are very active and are meeting with government officials, because I think that dialogue is very critical, because it's really hard, it's really easy to go back to the office and get stuck in a situation where there are business demands and everyone needs to move people faster and projects need